Today I am doing part 2 of my May wrap up, and yes, we are almost in July. If you want to see my previous video of the books I read in the first half of the month, I will link that above here. But yeah, let's just get right into it. I have 5 books I need to talk about. Some were kind of meh, and some were honestly really outstanding. So let's get into it. The first book I will be discussing that I read towards the end of the month was called Underground Barbie by Maša Kolanović. This is a translation from Croatian. It was translated by Selimovic. This is a very short book that deals with the disintegration of Yugoslavia from the Croat side. And the main character is a young girl when it happens, and so she plays a lot with her Barbies, some of whom are counterfeit Barbies, some of whom are actually from America, as a way to cope with the war going on around her that she doesn't really understand. And I didn't really understand either what was going on. I feel that to read this book, it would help to have knowledge of the disintegration of Yugoslavia beforehand and the Yugoslav wars. And, I think the beginning of this book started out strong, and it did make me feel kind of nostalgic for childhood in terms of child's play and how that is both an escapism, but also can mirror the events and dynamics that are going on around you. But this book actually focuses a lot on the dolls themselves, and there was quite a cast of characters, and I just don't think that this really landed for me. I think it was an original concept, but I'm not sure if I loved the execution. And again, I just unfortunately don't have the historical backdrop of the disintegration of Yugoslavia. I did go to Croatia, and I was briefly overwent the history on a tour bus, but it went in one ear and out the other because there's a lot of different players in that war. So I unfortunately rated this 2.5, or actually I think I rated 2.75 stars. I rounded up to 3 on Goodreads. The next book I read was a 5-star read. It was my first 5-star read. That was a fiction of the year, and that was A Beast Slinks Towards Beijing by Evelyn Yang. This is a multi-generational family saga, which I seem to read a lot of. It is historical fiction, and it has a magical realism element. And I have heard people compare this to Pachkinko, and I've also seen it compared to Flashlight by Susan Choi. Definitely does have the terms of like the father-daughter relationship. But I liked this more than Flashlight. I liked her writing better, Evelyn Yang's, which is quite a compliment because she's a debut author. So this follows the main character. Her name is Kwanze. I'm not saying that right. I'm so sorry. She is a Chinese American woman living in New York City in roughly the present. And her father disappeared when she was 14 years old. One day he just walked out of her life, and they never heard from him again. And she and her mom just had to pick up the pieces and move on in their life. And then one day she gets a call that her father has shown up at her childhood home, and he is asking for her. And so she ends up actually taking him back to her apartment in Chinatown. I think they live in Chinatown, yeah. When I was reading this book, I was picturing my apartment in Queens, so I thought for a second they were somewhere in Queens. And her father he's definitely unwell, and he's not quite mentally there. He's showing signs of dementia, but she is able to kind of untangle this story of his youth and why he left and how it's all linked. And so we follow like the different generations, right? We follow his mother as she was a young woman coming of age during the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, and she was a comfort woman, unfortunately. And then also his time as a young boy during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and he is a Red Guard, and all of the things that the Red Guards, the young boys who essentially kind of came into like these gangs, but said they were doing it on behalf of Mao and the government. And then we also then there's the present too. And there is this sort of like magical realism element of this prophecy. It was when he was a young boy, he uncovers this old woman, right, who tells him, I don't want to reveal too much of it, but the story deals a lot with like fate and what is fate and like free will and what is like laid out for you and what is like what is, you know, just of your own choices. And I thought it was really well done. I think that the only thing was I found the ending and the magical realism element, the way that tied up, to be a bit unsatisfying and not as memorable. And I almost think that I would have to purchase this book and reread it at some point. But I thought it was really well done. And it was very touching in terms of watching your parents age and cognitive and physical decline. It was touching in that way. So I did rate this 5 stars. And then the next book I read in the month of May was another 5-star read, and that was a book I purchased when I was on vacation, and it's called Bad Nature by Ariel Courage. This I talked about in my mid-year freakout tag. This is follows a woman named Hester the day after her 40th birthday, and she is diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she was working at a law firm, and she just decides to say, fuck it, I'm just gonna leave work and sell everything and drive west to kill my abusive father after I kill myself. So this is a road trip novel, essentially, because along the way, as she drives from the East Coast to the West Coast, she picks up a young man who is an environmental activist. He is in the private business, really, of photographing Superfund sites. And if you don't know what Superfund sites are, they are polluted locations designated by the EPA that are abandoned. Factories, landfills, mining zones, things like that, which I didn't even know the terminology. My partner does like environmental science stuff, so I didn't know that. And it is very tense. She's a very like caustic and somewhat unlikable character, but just, you know, as you get older as a woman, you give less and less of a fuck. That's her. And then amplify that times 10 because she has a terminal illness and she's going to die. There is a bit of like climate change anxiety mixed in with this, which I normally cannot read. I cannot read cli-fi stuff. And it's not cli-fi, but I thought that it was handled in a way that was sad and bleak, but yet it didn't quite bring me down. It made me feel less alone in a sense. So it is on the one hand like a road trip novel and a revenge novel, and also like an environmental, I don't know, love letter, hate letter. I love to read about women that are a little bit older, that are not like 25 years old, right? And I just really went through this so quickly. I thought it was great. It reminded me a tiny bit of She Drove Without Stopping by Jaimy Gordon. That was actually published, I think, in 1990. It is also another road trip novel of another kind of mentally off woman that has daddy issues. This is the book. Screams 1990s. Kind of gave off that vibe, but even more angry, I should say. So yeah, I love reading about angry women. I rated this 5 stars, and I definitely recommend it. The next book I read was a nonfiction, and that was Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights by Molly Smith and Juno Mack. This was really well done. This was such a good nonfiction novel that was very eye-opening and definitely challenged some of my preconceived notions. This was written by 2 sex workers, former sex workers maybe, and it offers a So I think in like mainstream narratives, there's sort of like two competing feminist narratives about sex work. There is the liberal feminist narrative of I do it, therefore it's empowering, that we see a lot in like social media. And then there is the radical feminist narrative that takes a rather carceral approach, that it is all inherently degrading and violent, and we need to save these women, and we need to use the state and cops to lock up pimps and johns. And the perspective in this book is from more of like a Marxist socialist analysis that states that why the carceral approach is wrong, why it is actually more harmful, why we should not be relying on the criminal justice system, and also why sex work is not empowering at all, but that it is a form of labor. This book talks a lot too about the relationship between sex work and trafficking and the difference between the two, and how a lot of people who are trafficked are not kidnapped like in Liam Neeson's Taken, but they are usually crossing borders, and then they owe a debt to the person that helped them cross, and that debt accumulates. And so there's a lot of things in here that I learned. There was a lot of really good analysis and counterpoints, particularly to the Nordic model that has been started in Sweden and was a way of partial decriminalizing of sex work, but still punishes buyers and pimps and brothel owners. And the authors go into great detail why that is actually very harmful to sex workers, all of the arbitrary laws that are in place, how it makes sex workers poorer, which therefore makes them more vulnerable, and more vulnerable not just to other clients, but in general to violence. And the ways of escape or exit that are offered under this kind of programs are really not very helpful at all, because there's all of these loopholes that are in place. The book's argument is essentially for full decriminalization. They also go into legalization as well, and the difference between the two, and why decriminalization is preferred. The authors themselves, like I said, are like Marxist, socialists, etc. And so she talks about how like sex work does not like exist within this vacuum. And it is tied into things like, yes, capitalism and borders and social safety nets and that all. But I did feel my only criticism, mild criticism, I would say, of this is sometimes it did feel a bit too maybe utopian, I would say, in the way that some socialists can be. I'm saying that as a socialist myself. I think that the idea that sex work would just be eradicated if we lived under a different economic system, I don't think is true. And you can see that when you look at other countries that were socialist at various points in time or still are currently. Cuba has a very large sex industry. And I think that regardless of if you want to say, like, were these countries socialist or not, they still were different economic models. And so I'm not entirely convinced that, like, yes, capitalism makes everything worse, specifically neoliberalism. But I'm not entirely convinced that if we have a different economic model, that sex work would ever truly fade. So I rated it 5 stars because I thought it was very well written. It opened my eyes to a lot of different viewpoints and facts that I was not aware of. And I think that if you are a feminist, or if you're just a woman, or anyone really, I think you should read it. So yes, 5 stars. And then the last book I read was called The Dinner Party by Viola van de Sandt. I rated this 3 stars. This book was difficult to read. The main character, I think this is a problem I have with main characters. I hate reading about main characters that are so passive and they just don't do anything and they're like frozen. And I understand that that is a very real human response, but I just don't really want to read about it because it's mildly infuriating. So this is about a young woman named Franca, It takes place in, I think, Britain, but she's from the Netherlands, and she is living with her fiance, Andrew, and she basically upended her life for this man. She dropped out of university, and she's living with him and almost essentially being like a stay-in girlfriend. And they're engaged, even though she's not really into it. And he works at some sort of startup, and he sold the startup, and so they're very financially well off. So the whole story takes place over the course of a night with a dinner party where that she is magically just like has to do everything and cook and do the dessert and all that. And some of the timing in this was a bit odd, like who just like magically starts cooking before the people are there, and then who just starts making dessert there. Like, I don't know, whatever. And very early on, there is on-page essay, and that's a whole sort of like seed germ of this novel that spirals, right? So Franca has this former friend that she was involved with who ends up showing up to this party, and something about this person's identity will be revealed to you later on. We're misled to believe one thing about this person, and then, so you're sort of set up to think that this is going to be like there's going to be a big event, right? There's a lot of foreshadowing with a knife on the floor and another timeline of this. So it's sort of like in the future she is sitting down with her therapist talking about her relationship with this man and what happened that night and all that. And it was just hard to read because she was just so like passive and threw her life away. I mean, I know that sounds melodramatic, but it just made me uneasy, and you just want to shake the main character. And I understand it's supposed to be realistic. There's even like almost this aside that she says to her therapist that I felt was the author talking directly to us through the character of like, well, you think that people who are victims should act a certain way, and this happens, but that only happens in Hollywood, and this is much more likely. And I'm like, yeah, but like, I don't know. This was just meh. I just rated it 3 stars. It was written fine. It was just the situation she was in and her passivity just was so irritating. So yes, that wraps up the 11 books I read in May. I read some great ones. And then, of course, in June, I read a lot of duds. So I will talk about that in the next video. But yeah, let me know if you have read any of these books or if you would like to. And I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.